Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening a file that I've honestly been staring at on my desk for about a week. And I didn't even know where to start because the implications of this one are just massive.
Oh, it is a massive topic.
It really is. We're looking at a book that feels, it feels like a collision between Indiana Jones, the X-Files, and a really dense theology textbook.
You know, that is probably the absolute most accurate genre description I've ever heard for this text.
Right. Because we are talking about fallen angels, giants literally devouring humanity, these wild cosmic tours of the universe, and a political war over a calendar.
Which sounds completely mundane until you realize what it actually meant to them.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, we aren't talking about some modern sci-fi novel. We're talking about an ancient religious text that was once a huge bestseller. Well, you know, if they had bestsellers back in the ancient world, it was incredibly popular among early Jews and early Christians. And then it just vanished.
It did. It went from being widely read, even quoted by the apostles, to being virtually a ghost in the Western world for nearly 1,000 years.
Which is wild. We are talking, of course, about one Enoch, the Book of Enoch. And before we get into the whole history of how it was lost and found, which, by the way, is a thriller in its own right, I want to start with the problem that this book actually tries to solve.
That's a great place to start.
Because for a lot of people, their very first encounter with this topic is, a really confusing Tuesday night Bible study where they open up Genesis chapter 6.
Ah, yes, the famous Sons of God passage.
Right. So you're reading along in Genesis. Everything is pretty normal, genealogies and such. And suddenly the text just casually drops this. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And then it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. And then scene. It just moves on.
It's incredibly abrupt.
It really is. Next verse. Noah is building the ark.
You are left staring at the page, asking, wait, who are the sons of God? What are Nephilim? And why does the text act like I should already know this?
Exactly. It's like walking into a movie theater halfway through the second act. You completely missed the origin story. And that is essentially what the Book of Enoch claims to be, isn't it? The missing prequel to the flood.
That is the perfect way to frame it. If Genesis 6 is the brief newspaper headline, Giants roam earth, God angry, then 1 Enoch is the 5,000-word investigative report that tells you exactly who messed up, how they did it, and what the specific fallout was. It fills in all those terrifying details that Genesis just leaves to the imagination.
So our mission today for you listening is to do a full forensic audit of this book. We have a massive stack of sources in front of us. We've got the archaeological reports from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have deep studies on Ethiopian manuscript traditions and some really fascinating academic papers on Mesopotamian demonology.
The Mesopotamian connection is going to surprise a lot of people, I think.
Oh, it completely blew my mind. We are going to unpack not just what the book says, but why it was kicked out of the Bible and how it managed to survive in two of the most remote places on Earth.
And I think we really have to start with that survival story. Because the mere fact that we can read this book today in English is something of a historical miracle.
It really is. For centuries in Europe, Enoch was basically a legend. Scholars knew about it because ancient church fathers, like Tertullian or Origin, would quote it in their writings. But nobody actually had a copy. It was the great lost book.
Right. It was arguably the most famous lost book in history. Until the late 18th century, if you asked the most relentless scholar in Oxford or Paris about Enoch, they would just shrug. It was gone.
But it wasn't gone everywhere. And this is where the story splits into two very different timelines. One ends in a dusty cave in the 1940s, and the other ends in the remote highlands of Africa.
Two incredibly different worlds.
Let's start with the cave, because that's the one everyone kind of knows from pop culture, but the details are almost always wrong.
The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
1947, the Judean Desert.
It's a really harsh landscape. You have to picture these jagged limestone cliffs, the burning sun beating down, the Dead Sea shimmering like oil in the distance. And you have this Bedouin shepherd, Muhammad Edib.
Also known as Muhammad the Wolf.
A fantastic name, by the way. Now, the popular story is that he was looking for a lost goat. There are other versions where he might have been looking for treasure or just hiding from the intense heat. But let's stick with the goat for now. He sees a cave opening high up in the cliff face.
And this is the moment that literally changes history. He picks up a rock.
He picks up a rock and he throws it into the darkness. Now, in a cave like that, you expect a dull thud. or maybe a click as it hits the limestone. But instead, he hears something very distinct, a crash.
The sound of breaking pottery.
Exactly. That sound is essentially the sound of 2,000 years of silence breaking. But here's the part people always forget. He didn't rush in to see what it was. He actually ran away.
Right, because of the jinn.
Yes, the jinn. In Bedouin folklore, these dark, empty, isolated places are the dwelling grounds of spirits. So breaking a jar in a pitch-black cave, that sounds like you just woke something terrible up. So he fled. He only came back later, I believe, with a companion to actually explore the cave.
When they finally did go in, they found the jars. And inside those jars were the scrolls. That was Cave 1. But for our story today, for the Book of Enoch, Cave 1 was really just the appetizer. The real jackpot, and honestly the real tragedy of the story, was Cave 4.
Oh, Cave 4 is heartbreaking and fascinating all at once. Cave 1 had the tall clay jars, which protected the scrolls inside them perfectly. Cave 4, which wasn't found until 1952, was essentially an open library shelf that had collapsed.
The scrolls there weren't in jars at all. They were just, well, they were just sitting there.
Just sitting on the cave floor.
Yeah.
For 2 millennia. Exposed to the humidity changes, to insects, and to a massive amount of bat guano. The source materials described the state of the scrolls in Cave 4 as being in unbelievable disorder. When the archaeologists finally got in there, they weren't finding nice rolled-up scrolls. They were finding a thick carpet of black, brittle fragments.
I've seen pictures of the scrollery. That's the room in Jerusalem where the scholars worked on this stuff. It looks like an absolute nightmare. You have these guys in the 1950s, chain-smoking cigarettes, holding tiny tweezers, trying to piece together tens of thousands of scraps of leather that have basically turned black with age.
It was, without a doubt, the world's most difficult jigsaw puzzle. And roughly 800 different manuscripts eventually came out of that single cave. But here is the kicker. Among those fragments, they identified multiple copies of the Book of Enoch.
Which proved that this wasn't just some fringe text that one guy wrote and buried.
Yeah.
The people living at Qumran had multiple copies. They were reading this thing constantly.
It was a verifiable bestseller for them. And they found fragments in Aramaic, which was the common everyday language of Judea at the time. This changed everything in biblical archaeology because it proved definitively that Enoch was a Jewish book written in the Semitic heartland long before the rise of Christianity.
But the scrolls were in pieces, tiny fragments. If you wanted to read the whole book start to finish, you couldn't do it at Qumran. For that, you had to go to the only place on earth that still treated this book as living scripture, Ethiopia.
Which brings us to what scholars call the Ethiopian exception. While the West completely forgot Enoch and the caves of Qumran hid it away in the dark, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was literally reading it every Sunday.
This completely blows my mind. We are talking about a completely different continent, a totally different language family. How in the world did a Jewish Aramaic text end up becoming the cornerstone of the Ethiopian Bible?
It is basically a multi-century game of telephone played across ancient empires. The original texts were written in Aramaic and some Hebrew. Then, as Alexander the Great and his successors Hellenized the world, all these Jewish books were translated into Greek. That's how the early Greek-speaking Christians read them.
Okay, so step 1 is Aramaic to Greek.
Right. And then, between the 4th and 6th centuries, the kingdom of Aksum, down in Ethiopia, formally accepted Christianity. A group of Syrian monks, known in Ethiopian history as the 9 Saints, came down and began a massive, ambitious translation project. They took the Greek Bible, which included Enoch at the time, and translated it into Ge'ez.
Ge'ez being the ancient Ethiopic language.
Correct. It's still the liturgical language there today, very much like Latin is for the Vatican. So the transmission chain goes from Aramaic to Greek to Ge'ez. And then, over the centuries, the Greek versions were completely lost. The Aramaic versions rotted away or were hidden in caves. And the Ge'ez version stood alone as the sole surviving complete text.
But there was a lot of skepticism for a long time, wasn't there? I remember reading that scholars in Europe said, sure, they have these manuscripts in Ethiopia, but they're probably late medieval inventions. They probably wrote them in the 15th century. How do we know this actually preserves the ancient text?
That period of doubt was known as the Silence. We had this huge gap between the supposed translation era in the 6th century and the earliest physical manuscripts we actually possessed, which were from the 14th or 15th century. European academics seriously doubted that parchment could survive the Ethiopian climate for 1,000 years.
And this is where the Grima Revolution comes in. I absolutely love it when hard science just shuts down historical skepticism.
It was a total bombshell in the academic world. The Garima Gospels are these beautifully illuminated ancient books kept at the Abagarima Monastery in the Tigray region. For years, local tradition said they were from the early 6th century. Western scholars looked at them and said, impossible. It's too humid. There are termites. They must be from the 11th century at the absolute earliest.
And then they finally used carbon dating.
They did, and the results came back definitively dating the parchment to between 330 and 650 CE.
That is just incredible.
It proved that the Ethiopian tradition wasn't making things up. They really had preserved physical books from the very beginning of their Christian history. It validated their entire transmission chain.
Yeah.
If they could preserve the Gospels that long, they could absolutely preserve Enoch.
And they didn't just preserve them by, leaving them on a dusty shelf. They had to actively protect them from invasions. The sources mention the island vaults of Lake Tana.
It's such a stunning image to picture. Lake Tana is this massive body of water, the source of the Blue Nile. It's huge, often covered in mist and filled with these little islands. Monasteries like Hebron Gabriel were intentionally built on these islands. When religious wars swept through the mainland, like the devastating invasions of Queen Gudit in the 10th century, or the brutal war with Ahmad Gran in the 16th century, the monks would take the precious manuscripts and retreat to the islands.
So the water literally acted as a natural moat.
Exactly. These islands became highly secure vaults of ancient knowledge. While great libraries in Alexandria or Constantinople were burning down, these monks were out on islands in the highlands of Africa, meticulously copying the Book of Enoch by candlelight, preserving the story of the Watchers for future generations.
Okay, so we have the physical text, we have the scattered Aramaic fragments from the Dead Sea, and we have the beautifully preserved, complete Gaia's version from Ethiopia. Now, let's finally open the book. What is actually in it? Because you mentioned earlier that it's not really one single book.
No, 1 Enoch is much more like a library. It's an anthology. Modern scholars have identified 5 distinct booklets inside it that were written by completely different authors at different times, probably between 300 BCE and the 1st century CE. And then they were all stitched together to look like one long, continuous memoir by the ancient patriarch Enoch.
So let's walk through this library. Book 1, the Book of the Watchers. This is the one everyone wants to hear about. This is the big scandal.
This is the dramatic expansion of that weird Genesis 6 passage. It tells the story of 200 angels, who are called the Watchers, who decide to rebel against God.
And they have a specific leader.
Yes, his name is Shemi-Haza, or sometimes translated as Semi-Haza.
It's interesting that there's a clear leader. It makes the whole rebellion feel very organized, not just a random act of passion.
Oh, it is highly organized. In the text, they all gather on the summit of Mount Hermon, and Shemi-Haza is actually deeply afraid. He says to the others, "I fear you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin."
So he's afraid of being the fall guy. He doesn't want to be left holding the bag if God punishes them.
Exactly. So to prevent that, they all swear a binding oath. They bind themselves with mutual curses. They essentially say, we are all in this together. If we go down as one.
That sounds exactly like a mob pact. Like a mafia family swearing omerta.
It effectively is a cosmic mob pact, and then they descend to Earth. They take human wives. And this is the part that I think is absolutely most crucial for understanding the theology of the book. The core sin isn't just the physical act of taking wives. The sin is the teaching.
What do you mean by the teaching?
The Watchers didn't just intermarry with humans. They actively educated them. They brought secret, classified knowledge from heaven that humanity wasn't supposed to have yet. The text highlights another key figure, a watcher named Asel, or Azazel.
Wait, is he distinct from Shemi-Haza?
Yes, Shemi-Haza is the political leader of the pact. Asel is more like the chief technologist. The text specifically says Asel taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught them the dark art of making weapons of war.
So metallurgy, he gave them the arms race.
Yes, and he didn't stop there. He taught the women about antimony and how to make eyeshadow and the use of precious stones and coloring dyes.
Okay, wait, hold on. So the forbidden fruit in the Book of Enoch is makeup and weapons. That seems like a really strange specific list to pair together.
It definitely sounds strange to us today. But think about what those things represented in the ancient world. Weapons represent violence, bloodshed, and the unnatural ability to kill your neighbor on a mass scale. Makeup, in the strict context of that ancient patriarchal culture, represented artificial seduction, lust, and the breakdown of sexual boundaries. The author is looking around at his world and saying, Look at our society. Look at the constant war. Look at the rampant promiscuity. This isn't natural human behavior. This is a foreign virus inserted into us by fallen divine beings.
Wow, that is a powerful theological shift. It takes the ultimate blame for the world's evil off of humans and puts it squarely on these outside spiritual invaders.
Precisely. The other watchers teach magic, root cutting, which is early pharmacy, and spell casting, divination, and astrology. They are leaking classified technological and magical information from heaven down to earth.
And the direct result of this corrupted knowledge and these forbidden physical unions is the giants, the Nephilim.
And they are absolute monsters in this text. The book says they were 3,000 ells tall, which is mathematically impossibly huge. But the theological point is their sheer unquenchable appetite. They consume all the agricultural produce that the humans grow. Then, when the food runs out, they consume the animals. Then they start eating the people. And finally, in their madness, they start eating each other and drinking the blood.
It's literally an ancient zombie movie, just pure consumption.
It's total chaos. It's the rapid undoing of God's creation. And that is why the flood has to happen. In the Enochian worldview, the flood isn't just God getting mad at people for being generally bad. It's a necessary, targeted decontamination protocol to wipe out the giant hybrids and cleanse the earth of the corrupted technology they brought.
And Enoch is the guy caught in the middle. The text says the fallen angels actually ask Enoch to go to God and petition for their forgiveness, and God just says absolutely not, which is fascinating. But let's move on to Book 2, the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes. Now, there is a massive mystery here regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
A huge, glaring mystery. We found multiple fragments of Book 1, Book 3, Book 4, and Book 5 at Qumran. We found absolutely 0 fragments of Book 2.
Why does that matter so much?
Because Book 2 is arguably the most theologically explosive section. It focuses entirely on a heavenly figure called the Son of Man, or sometimes the Chosen One or the Righteous One.
Son of Man. I mean, that is the exact title Jesus uses for himself constantly in the Gospels.
Over and over again. It's his preferred self-designation. In the Book of Parables, this Son of Man is a pre-existent divine figure who sits on a glorious throne and judges the kings and the mighty of the earth. The parallels with the New Testament's description of Jesus are so overwhelmingly strong that for a very long time, scholars said, oh, this must be a Christian forgery. Christians clearly wrote this section later and stuffed it into the Enoch scroll to make Jesus look historically legitimate.
Is that still the consensus view?
Not at all. Most scholars today agree it is an authentic Jewish text, probably from the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE. The fact that it's completely missing from Qumran is puzzling. Maybe the Qumran community rejected that specific booklet. Maybe they just didn't have a copy yet. But the implication for biblical studies is massive. It means that when Jesus called himself the Son of Man, he wasn't just being poetic about being human. He was directly referencing a well-known divine judging character from this specific tradition.
He was hypertext linking to the Book of Enoch. He was essentially telling his Jewish audience, you know that cosmic guy in the Book of Parables who sits on the throne and judges the world? Yeah, that's
Exactly. It completely changes how we understand Jesus' claim to divine authority in his own historical context.
Okay, let's look at Book 3, the astronomical book, also known as the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. This is where the angel Uriel takes Enoch on a tour and shows him the literal mechanics of the sun, the moon, and the stars. On the surface, if you just read it, this sounds like a really dry, ancient science lesson. But our research notes say this was actually a political bombshell. How exactly is a calendar political?
This is super hard for modern people to grasp because for us, our calendar is just a background app on our phone. We don't think about it. But in the ancient world, the calendar actively controlled your entire relationship with God. The astronomical book aggressively, polemically argues for a strict 364-day solar calendar.
Solar, as opposed to what?
The lunar calendar, which is about 354 days long, the official priests in Jerusalem, the Sadducees, and later the Pharisees operated the temple on a lunar-based system.
So do the math for me here. If I'm at Qumran using a 364-day solar calendar, and you're in Jerusalem using a 354-day lunar calendar.
We are functionally living in different religious realities. Imagine it's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Literally the holiest, most terrifying day of the year for a devout Jew. For the Qumran community using the Enochian solar calendar, today is the day to fast in sackcloth and beg God for national forgiveness. But they look up the hill at Jerusalem at the official temple, and what do they see? The The priests are cooking, they're working, they're treating it like a normal secular Tuesday.
Because according to their lunar calendar, Yom Kippur isn't until next week.
Exactly. And vice versa. To the Enoch group, to the Qumran community, this was completely horrifying. It meant the temple was spiritually polluted. It meant the daily sacrifices were entirely invalid because they were being offered on the wrong days. It meant the cosmic order established by God at creation, the literal movement of the sun, was being completely ignored by the very priests who were supposed to uphold it.
So they didn't leave Jerusalem and go live in caves in the desert just because they didn't like the high priest's personality. They left because they truly believed the priesthood had broken time itself.
Correct. The astronomical book isn't just dry science. It's a radical protest manifesto. It's saying to the establishment, we have the true time, you are lost in darkness, and your sacrifices mean nothing.
Wow. That makes the endless, dry details in that chapter about the moon's gates feel a lot more intense. Let's hit book 4 quickly. The dream visions, specifically the part called the animal apocalypse.
I love this section. It's the entire history of the world retold as an allegory using animals. Adam is born as a white bull. The early patriarchs are bulls. But then, starting with Jacob, the Israelites become represented as a flock of sheep.
And the surrounding enemy nations.
Wolves, lions, tigers, vultures, the Gentiles are all wild predators. So the history of Israel is depicted as this incredibly vulnerable flock of sheep constantly being torn apart and devoured by wild beasts, while the shepherd representing God seems to just stand by and look away.
It perfectly captures the psychological feeling of vulnerability of a conquered people.
It really does. But it ends with a massive revolution. The text says, young sheep are born little lambs who suddenly open their eyes and grow large horns. They start violently fighting back against the wolves and the ravens. Historically, this is almost certainly a direct reference to the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BCE.
So this specific booklet was likely written right around that time. It's essentially wartime propaganda. It's telling the fighters, we are the young sheep growing horns. God is waking us up.
Yes, and the vision ends with God finally coming down, setting up a throne of judgment, and casting the fallen stars, the Watchers, and the predatory beasts, the Gentile empires, into an abyss of fire.
Finally, we have Book 5, the Epistle of Enoch.
This is essentially the moral wrap-up of the whole collection. It's a testament written like a farewell address filled with prophetic woes. Woe to the rich, woe to those who rely on their temporal wealth, woe to the sinners who think God isn't keeping a record of their crimes. It's a deeply comforting text for a persecuted, marginalized minority, telling them, just hold on, justice is coming, even if you don't see it today.
So we have this incredible multi-layered library. But as we keep peeling back the historical layers, we find that the roots of this story go even deeper than the Jewish tradition itself. You mentioned in the intro that the Watchers narrative is actually a theological remix of older Mesopotamian mythology.
This is one of the absolute best examples of ancient cultural warfare we have on record. So we need to travel mentally to Babylon and Assyria. In their grand mythology, long before the Great Flood, advanced civilization was brought down to humanity by a group of beings called the Apkallu.
The Apkallu.
Yes, these were the 7 sages. They were sent by the great god Ea, or Enki, emerging from the chaotic, watery deep.
And visually, how were they depicted? Because I've seen these statues in museums.
They are very striking. They are often depicted as fishmen. If you look at ancient Assyrian palace reliefs, you see these large, muscular figures wearing literal fish cloaks, holding little buckets and pine cones, standing protectively next to the human king. They were revered as the divine guardians of royal wisdom and statecraft.
So to a Babylonian or an Assyrian, the Apkallu are the ultimate good guys. They brought writing, they brought law, mathematics, city building. They are the very reason Babylon is a great superpower.
Exactly. The human king derives his entire right to rule from the secret wisdom they provided. Now, look at what the author of Enoch does. He takes this universally known, revered myth and completely inverts it. He says, you know those brilliant sages you worship? The ones who taught you all your advanced civilization? They aren't heroes. They are rebellious, fallen angels. They are literal demons.
That is just.
Yeah.
It is incredibly bold to write that while living under their shadow.
It's a searing political polemic. It's a direct theological attack on the Babylonian and Persian superpowers. The Jewish author is essentially saying, your great empire, your advanced metallurgy, your massive wealthy cities, it's all the fruit of a poison tree. You didn't get your wisdom from the one true God. You got corrupted, stolen secrets from cosmic rebels.
So it's basically saying, your greatest heroes are actually our worst demons.
And notice the specific parallels. The Apkallu are fishmen who come up from the sea to teach. The Watchers are angels who descend from heaven to teach. The Apkallu teach the grand arts of civilization. Asel teaches metallurgy for weapons and makeup for seduction. It's the exact same list of civilizational gifts, but in Enoch, the gifts are exposed as absolute curses.
That historical context is so crucial. It completely explains why the Enoch text is so deeply suspicious of what we would call scientific or secret knowledge.
Right, because in the standard biblical view, true wisdom starts with the fear of the Lord. It's highly relational, it's humble. In Mesopotamia and in the worldview of the Watchers, wisdom is pure power. It's technology, it's magic, it's the ability to manipulate the world. Enoch is warning us that knowledge divorced from God is just a weapon.
Let's connect this back to the real people who lived out this worldview, the Qumran community who copied these scrolls. Scholars call this specific movement Enochic Judaism. What does their everyday world actually look like?
Imagine a highly disciplined community living out in the blistering desert, completely isolated from normal society, absolutely convinced that they are the pure sons of light, and everyone else, including the mainstream Jews running the temple in Jerusalem, are corrupted sons of darkness.
It sounds incredibly paranoid.
It was ultra-vigilant. For them, the story of the Watchers wasn't just ancient mythical history about stuff that happened before Noah. It perfectly explained their current, terrifying reality. They believed that the spiritual corruption unleashed by the Watchers was still highly active and targeting them specifically.
And this leads us directly into their demonology. This was a point in the source material that really stopped me in my tracks, because their explanation for where demons actually come from is, it's remarkably logical, in a really terrifying, internally consistent way.
It creates a perfectly consistent physics of the spiritual world.
Yeah.
So walk through it with me. You have the giants, the Nephilim, they're biological hybrids, half angel, half human.
Right, an unnatural mix.
Exactly. When the flood comes, their physical bodies drown, they die in the water. But what happens to their animating spirit? The spirit is half immortal because of the angelic parentage. It can't go up to heaven because it's deeply corrupt and an abomination.
Yeah.
But it also can't go down to Sheol, the human land of the dead, because it's not fully human.
So it has literally nowhere to go in the cosmos.
It is entirely trapped on Earth. The evil spirits, or what we call demons, are literally the disembodied, wandering ghosts of the dead giants.
That is horrifying. I grew up thinking a demon was just another name for a fallen angel, but in this view, they're totally different things.
Completely different. The fallen angels themselves, the original Watchers like Shemhaza, are currently bound in chains in the dark abyss under the earth. They are locked up securely until final judgment day. The demons you encounter in everyday life are their bastard children, roaming the earth as invisible spirits. And because they used to have massive physical bodies that constantly ate everything, they're perpetually hungry, perpetually angry, and desperately looking for human bodies to inhabit.
Wow. So when a Qumran monk sitting in his cave felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to sin, or suddenly got physically sick, or felt a wave of deep depression,
He didn't think, oh, I caught a desert virus, or I'm just having a chemically bad mental health day. He thought, I am currently under active, targeted attack by the invisible spirit of a dead giant trying to ruin my purity. It was constant, agonizing psychological warfare.
the sources mention that to fight this, they actually used their religious liturgy as a weapon.
They absolutely did. They had specific medical and magical texts in their library, things like the Songs of the Sage, which were essentially preemptive exorcism songs. The community leader, known as the maskell or the instructor, would lead these chants. They genuinely believed that by reciting specific psalms and declaring the intense holiness of God, they could actively frighten and terrify these demonic spirits away from the camp.
They used worship as a literal shield.
And as an offensive sword. Understanding this Enochic background makes the scenes in the New Testament where Jesus is constantly casting out demons feel so much more charged. When Jesus confronts a demon in a synagogue, he isn't just doing a neat magic trick. He's stepping onto the front lines of an ongoing, grueling spiritual war that these desert communities had been trying to fight for centuries.
So we have this incredibly rich, complex, deeply influential book. It's explicitly quoted by Jude in the New Testament. It heavily shapes the early Christian view of demons, of the Son of Man as the Messiah, of the end times. So the obvious question for most people is, why isn't it in my standard Bible? Why do I have to go buy a separate academic translation on Amazon to read it?
That is the million-dollar question in biblical studies. And to answer it, we really have to avoid the whole Dan Brown Da Vinci Code version of history here. There was no single secret council where a bunch of angry old men sat in a smoky room and said, ban this book. It knows too much about the aliens.
So it wasn't a grand, deliberate conspiracy.
Not at all. It was much more of a slow, boring, historical drift, a combination of changing geography, language barriers, and shifting theological tastes.
Let's unpack the geography part first.
The Canon of the Western Church, which eventually became the standard Catholic and later Protestant Bibles, was finalized by bishops who mostly lived in the Roman Latin-speaking world or the Greek-speaking centers. By the time they were having the major canonization debates in the 4th century, the physical Book of Enoch had basically already fallen out of circulation in those specific areas.
Because it wasn't being copied in Latin. It was effectively out of print.
Basically, yes. You can't vote to include a book in the Bible if you've never actually read it, and none of your local churches are using it. The text survived robustly in the East, down in Ethiopia, and to some extent in Egypt, but the Western bishops finalizing the lists simply didn't have it on their desks.
But they had to have known about it, right? Because as we said, the book of Jude explicitly quotes Enoch in the New Testament. Jude literally says Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about these men.
They definitely knew of its existence. And for a while, that exact quote in Jude protected it. Tertullian, a very prominent early church father, famously argued that we should absolutely accept Enoch as scripture specifically because Jude quotes it. But as time went on, the cultural tide turned against it.
Why? What changed their minds?
The weirdness factor. As early Christianity moved away from its Jewish roots and tried to become philosophically respectable in the highly educated Greco-Roman world, the literal story of angels coming down, having physical sex with human women, and birthing giant cannibals became deeply embarrassing.
Right, because to a sophisticated Greek philosopher, that sounds exactly like a pagan myth. It sounds like Zeus coming down in disguise to sleep with women and birthing Hercules or the Titans.
Exactly. Sophisticated theologians like St. Augustine looked at the Enoch story and said, no, this cannot possibly be literal history. Angels don't have physical bodies. So Augustine popularized the view that the sons of God merely referred to the righteous human line of Seth, and the daughters of men meant the ungodly human line of Cain.
They completely allegorized the supernatural elements out of it.
They sanitized it for a Roman audience. And once the church decides the angel sex interpretation is officially wrong, the Book of Enoch suddenly becomes a massive theological liability. It vividly teaches the wrong interpretation. So it was quietly but firmly pushed to the margins until it disappeared entirely.
And what about the Jewish community? Because it was originally a Jewish text, why did the rabbis reject it from the Hebrew Bible?
Two main reasons for the rabbis. First, the calendar issue we talked about. Rabbinic Judaism survived the destruction of the temple and solidified around the lunar calendar. They were absolutely not going to adopt a text that explicitly condemned their calendar as demonic. It was a complete non-starter. Second, the Christians.
The Christians ruined Enoch for the Jewish community.
In a very real way, yes. The early Christians were actively using the Son of Man passages from the Book of Parables to argue forcefully that Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. So, for the Jewish rabbis trying to distinguish themselves from this new sect, Enoch became viewed as a Christianized book. It was providing way too much ammunition to the other side.
So the Jews rejected it because it felt too Christian, and the Christians rejected it because it felt too weird and pagan.
Exactly. It fell right into the massive historical crack between the two growing religions, except, of course, down in Ethiopia.
The Ethiopian exception strikes again. Why did it stick so firmly there?
Because Ethiopian Christianity is unique. It never fully severed its cultural and liturgical roots with Second Temple Judaism. If you go to an Ethiopian Orthodox Church today, you will see they still practice male circumcision. They keep the Sabbath on Saturday as well as Sunday. They have strict dietary laws that are very similar to Jewish kosher laws.
So the ancient, strict culture of the Book of Enoch completely matched the living culture of the Ethiopian people.
Perfectly. To an Ethiopian monk reading the text, a book obsessed with strict purity laws, angelic hierarchies, and rigid calendar observance, didn't feel weird or pagan at all. It felt exactly like home. They didn't see any theological reason to throw it out. It was thoroughly integrated into their national epic, the Kebra Nagast. It was chanted in their daily liturgy. To them, it wasn't some apocryphal fringe curiosity. It was the sacred word of God.
And honestly, thank goodness they kept it, or we wouldn't even be having this deep dive today.
We would just have a few blackened fragments from a cave and a lot of wild guesses. Because of the Ethiopian monks, we have the whole massive picture.
So as we wrap up this journey, let's talk about the broader theological implications. If we take this book seriously, not necessarily saying it's infallible scripture for everyone, but recognizing it as the mental furniture of the New Testament authors. Does understanding Enoch change how we read the rest of the Bible?
It sharpens the picture of Jesus significantly, in my opinion. I think the most powerful takeaway is the stark contrast between the mission of Jesus and the mission of the Watchers.
Walk me through that contrast.
The Watchers represent false wisdom. They come down from heaven and they offer humanity raw power. They say, here is how you forge deadly weapons. Here is how you use magic to aggressively control your reality. Here is how you seduce and dominate others. It's wisdom from below, entirely focused on exploitation and self-elevation.
And Jesus is the exact opposite.
Jesus is true wisdom. He comes down not to teach humanity how to forge better swords, but to explicitly tell Peter to put his sword away. He doesn't teach magical exploitation. He teaches radical self-sacrifice and love for enemies.
The Watchers' children, the giants, build massive cities and violently devoured the world's resources. Jesus builds a community, a church, and miraculously feeds the 5,000.
It is a total intentional inversion of the myth. Even the directional movement is opposite. Think about it. Enoch, the mere human, has to ascend up into heaven to get the divine secrets. Jesus, the divine word, willingly descends down to earth to clearly reveal the heart of the Father to everyone.
Wow. That really reframes things. It also adds a much darker shade to the end times warnings in the Gospels.
It definitely does. Jesus famously says, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man.
Usually when you hear a sermon on that, preachers say it just means people will be complacent. You know, eating and drinking, getting married, just going about daily life, ignoring God until the floodwaters hit.
But if you read that exact phrase through the Enochic lens, the days of Noah isn't just about people partying and being apathetic. It's specifically about the Watchers. It's about a unique era when the firm boundary between the human and the spiritual realms was violently breached. It's about a time when false knowledge, unnatural technology, and genetic corruption were running absolutely rampant.
It implies a literal return of that chaos, a return of the hybrids, or at least a return of that forbidden, destructive teaching.
It heavily suggests that the final crisis of humanity won't just be about bad morals. It will involve a massive deception related to hidden knowledge and technological power, just like the first crisis did.
Which perfectly brings us to our final thought for today, the provocation.
Yes, we always like to leave you with something to really chew on after the episode ends.
When we look closely at the Book of Enoch, we see an ancient society that was utterly destroyed, specifically because it became obsessed with secret knowledge. They were obsessed with new technology, advanced weaponry, and fundamentally altering the boundaries of the human condition.
And then we look at our own world today.
Right. We are living squarely in the age of artificial intelligence. We are actively biohacking our own DNA. We split the atom to make weapons of mass destruction. We literally have access to all the knowledge in the world in our pockets.
We have thoroughly mastered the advanced metallurgy and the magical root cutting of our day. We are aggressively chasing the secrets of the universe with the exact same unquenchable hunger that the ancients chased the teachings of the Watchers.
So the provocative question for you is this.
Yeah.
Are we unwittingly living through a modern echo of the Watchers' influence?
Are we just eating from the tree of knowledge again, or are we actively sitting at the feet of the fishmen, begging for more power?
And honestly, more importantly, is our endless obsession with the next big breakthrough. You know, the next software update, the next government leak, the next life hack. Is it completely distracting us from the very simple, quiet wisdom that God actually asks for?
To do justice, to
Go ahead.
love mercy, to walk humbly. It's not a secret formula. It's not a magical life hack. But it is the only true wisdom that actually saves humanity from itself.
Man, that is a question that makes you look at your smartphone a little differently when you turn this off.
It certainly makes me pause.
Well, we have traveled all the way from the dusty caves of the Dead Sea to the remote island monasteries of Ethiopia, from the dark rebellion of fallen angels to the cosmic judgment of the Son of Man. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive.
It has been an absolute pleasure to unpack this with you.
Thank you all so much for listening. Keep asking the hard questions, keep digging deep into the sources, and always remember, sometimes the oldest, strangest stories are actually the most relevant to our lives today. See you on the next one.